This is Michael Azado, Self-Video 1. In this video, I will be discussing policy formulation, which is covered in pages 114 to 132 of Anderson. As we learned from Chapter 1 of Anderson, there are 5 stages of the public policy cycle: agenda setting, formulation, adoption, implementation, and evaluation, which then feeds back to agenda setting. I will focus on policy formulation. First of all, what is public policy formulation? Policy formulation is the development of pertinent and acceptable proposed courses of action for dealing with a public problem. Again, public policy formulation is a stage after agenda setting. Thus, once a problem is recognized as an important enough problem to be put on the agenda, policymakers will formulate a proposal for dealing with that problem. Formulation doesn't always result in an actual policy. Policymakers may decide to let matters work themselves out, or they may be unable to agree on what to do. Policy formulation typically does not start from scratch. Many times policymakers will look to see how similar problems were resolved. Policy formulators must keep many factors in mind when thinking of their chances of producing a successful public policy. Anderson lists 4 such factors. 1. Is the proposal technically sound and directed at the problem's causes? 2. Is there enough money in the budget to cover the cost of the proposal? 3. Can the policy gain enough support to be accepted? 4. If the proposal becomes a law, will it be accepted by the public? Anderson then discusses who is involved in public policy formulation. He primarily focuses on the national government in doing so. The first person involved in government action and public policy formulation is the President. The President is the leading source of initiative in forming major policy proposals. He gets his proposals either from the bureaucracy or from policies that have been floating around from Congress. Congress expects the President to present them with draft bills embodying his recommendations. In essence, the President drafts the bills and Congress works them over. Congress doesn't always follow the President's recommendations, but presidential recommendations do help Congress set its agenda. A question for discussion about this is, why do you think the President is the leading source of initiative in forming major policy proposals? Another group involved in policy formulation is governmental agencies. Governmental agencies become aware of new policy problems, deficiencies in existing laws, and develop proposals to deal with them. They then send these proposals to Congress. Because of their expertise, agency officials are in a good technical position to engage in formulating public policy. Many agency proposals are aimed at bolstering existing laws. Another group involved in policy formulation is presidential organizations. These organizations, also known as adhocracies, can be established by the President to study particular policy areas and to develop policy proposals. Examples of these organizations include presidential commissions, task forces, and interagency committees. Members of these include legislative and executive officials, and even private citizens. President Lyndon Johnson appointed over 100 task forces to develop legislative proposals in his presidency. An obvious group involved in policy formulation is legislators. Legislators receive suggestions for action on problems and formulate proposed courses of action. The capacity of members of Congress to engage in policy formulation has been strengthened by the creation of the House and Senate offices of the Legislative Council and the Congressional Research Service. Also, the staff of the members of Congress are a big help. In fact, much of the work in drafting legislation is handled by congressional staff. Much of the writing of legislation is handled by congressional staff members. Congress has done much of the formulation in policy areas such as environmental protection, agriculture, and energy conservation. The last group involved in policy formulation is interest groups. They play a major role in policy formulation and often go to the legislature with specific proposals for legislation. They may work with executive and legislative officials to develop policies that suit their interests. Competing proposals may result from a clash of interest groups. Anderson then explains policy formulation as a technical process. Policy formulation involves two very different sorts of activities. Firstly, policymakers have to decide what to be done about a problem. Questions pertaining to this include what should the minimum wage be, and what restrictions should there be on abortion. Answers to these types of questions will be general principles or statements. After these questions are resolved, the second type of activity takes place, which is drafting legislation and administrative rules that will appropriately carry the agreed upon principles or statements into effect. This activity can be a very technical process and working out the details of the policy. Careful formulation is very important or negative consequences might ensue. Bills need to be technically sound because people will look for loopholes in them and try to work around the laws. Another reason why laws must be protected is because unfavorable judicial interpretations might result from them. Often judges will look at the law's legislative history to clarify the meaning of laws. This is called a contextualist approach. If Congress disagrees with judicial interpretation of its intent, the court's action can be overcome by legislation clarifying the meaning of the law. However, Justice Scalia of the Supreme Court, among others, has a textualist approach to examining laws which evaluates what the law actually says rather than looking at the legislator's intentions. The courts can become an integral part of the legislative process as policies must be constitutional. Anderson presents a case study to explain the policy formulation process further. The case study discusses the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. After World War II, national medical care issues have frequently been on the agenda. The Johnson administration persuaded Congress to enact legislation to create Medicare and Medicaid. President Clinton focused on keeping costs down for Medicare and Medicaid. President Obama became committed to health care reform by the time he won the election in 2008. Conservatives opposed health care reform, thinking that the U.S. has the best system in the world for health care. However, 46 million people had no health insurance, and the U.S. spends more on health care than any other country. Since so many people were satisfied with their healthcare reform was hard to achieve. Obama left most of the details of healthcare reform to Congress, but did set some goals, which include expanding access to health insurance and medical services, and regulating the private insurance business. Early in the policy struggle, the president, administrative officials, and congressional leaders met with representatives of healthcare organizations to lessen their opposition. Eventually, bargains were arrived at. The drug industry was also involved in lobbying. Three committees in the House considered and approved versions of the healthcare legislation and melded it into a single bill. After some amendments and negotiations, the bill was passed in the House of Representatives. Then the bill was passed to the Senate. The Senate formed a gang of six, which negotiated for 4 months. Individual members of Congress could bargain in the Senate, since every vote in the Senate was critical for the bill to be passed. The bill finally was passed in the Senate as well, and was signed by President Obama as the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act. Later, the Affordable Care Act was voted on and passed by a narrow margin in the Senate and the House. Lastly, the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act to be constitutional, and National Federation of Independent Business versus Sebelius, with a 5-4 vote. This case study shows the struggle of the policy to be formulated and finally be adopted by the government. In closing, problem identification, agenda setting, and policy formulation occur before a decision is made about what will become public policy. In reality, it is often difficult to separate policy formulation from policy adoption, the next step in the public policy cycle. The stages of formulation and adoption are often performed by the same people and institutions and thus go hand in hand. One final question for discussion is, what do you think the most difficult part of policy formulation is?